Welcome back. We're going to finish up this week talking about three plants that humans have a long time relationship with and that really change our lives. And those three plants are coffee, tea, and chocolate. Specifically, the tea plant, the Camellia sinensis plant, that's the one plant that all teas are based on. Green tea, black tea, white tea, oolong tea, power tea. Those teas are all actually coming from the same plant. And it just has to do with how they dry the plant and let it oxidize, which means mix it with oxygen, and how they um, roll the tea that those different teas are produced. The cacao tree, interestingly enough, grows its blossoms and its fruit right out of the trunk. It's not something that we're used to seeing in North America and the United States, but it actually just pops blossoms and giant cacao pods right out of the tree. Now, in the wild, these things grow up to about 50 feet, but harvest when they trim the tops of them to keep them small for harvesting, because they still hand harvest these trees. They only grow to about 15 to 20 feet, and they produce a mature tree can produce about 2,000 cacao pods per year. And the cool thing is there's no season for growing because this is a tropical plant. They just grow year round. There's just always cacao growing. So they've got chocolate year round coming at us, which is really pretty amazing. When you have a little orchard of cacao trees, you're always going to have a pretty good supply of cacao pods coming in. Now, these are harvested very differently than the tea. You can't just pull the chocolate seeds out. You can't just crack the thing open, there's chocolate inside. You actually let the pod, which is filled with a white, delicious, tropical, fleshy fruit that you can eat, you actually let that fruit ferment. You let it rot, and that actually helps. The acidity helps to kind of mellow out the tannins, these bitter things that are inside of the chocolate. And so what we do is the farmers harvest the pods, and then they let them rot for a couple of weeks, and then they take those seeds and they roast them, and they're kind of very chalky and bitter at that point still. And then they grind those things down to make a couple of different things. They have cocoa butter, which is something that they will use to blend back in to make chocolate with. And they will have that rich, thick, dark cocoa powder, which we also use to make chocolate. Or you might have some cocoa powder that you can that they mix with sugar to make hot chocolate, or you might have some cocoa powder in your cabinet. Lastly, there is also coffee. And coffee comes from a shady shrub, which is kind of nice because it means they don't have to clear a lot of rainforest to grow the coffee. In fact, if they do clear the rainforest, their coffee won't grow well because it's shade grown. Too much sun is actually bad for coffee, so it needs to grow under the canopy of other trees. So people grow coffee in that way, shaded under other trees. And when they pick it, it's actually this red, ripe berry, of all things, because that seed is actually inside the coffee. And when you open it up, inside you find a seed that is, guess what color? It's white. It is not those black coffee beans that you imagine. In fact, that outer fruit, that delicious, sweet outer fruit that's incredibly healthy for humans, needs to get husked off of there. And then when they get all those coffee beans, they have to roast them just like they did the chocolate, but they don't separate the coffee. They can just roast those coffee beans, and then people grind those to make their coffee in whatever way they choose to make their coffee. Now, what are the three similarities in all of these plants? Chocolate is filled with caffeine. This cacao is filled with caffeine, which is makes us excited, gives us a whole lot of energy. It's hard to sleep when you've had some caffeine. Coffee gives you a bunch of caffeine, and tea gives you a bunch of caffeine. So, interestingly, humans have this relationship with these three plants that makes us more excited and gives us more energy. That caffeine that also makes it a little harder to sleep. Now, something really essential about caffeine that most people don't know is that caffeine has a half-life. So if you have a bunch of caffeine, if you eat some chocolate, if you drink some coffee, if you drink some tea, you get that first burst of caffeine, and then after you get that, you get a second burst of caffeine, and you get a third and a fourth, and it diminishes over time. But this is why many adults try not to drink coffee or tea or eat chocolate too late in the day, because too much caffeine is going to make it really hard for people to sleep. And as kids, it's also really nice to try to stay away from too much caffeine. So how do they make chocolate that you eat? Well, as I said, first they're going to harvest those chocolate seeds. They're going to from the pod, and then they're going to roast those seeds, and then it's going to get ground down to both the cacao butter, this cocoa butter, and then also the cacao powder. And then they mix those back together with sugar, and they're going to make your chocolate. And if your chocolate is considered a dark chocolate, if it's at least 70% cacao, at least if it's at least 70% of the cocoa butter and the cocoa powder that they took out of that. So you might not like a dark chocolate, because chocolate, the type of chocolate that we like to eat, the hardier pods that are easier to grow, is actually the most bitter type of chocolate, unfortunately. So due to the price of chocolate, we have commercially grown mostly the bitter pods. There's a Criollo type of chocolate, which is a much more light and mellow flavor and doesn't need that much sugar to sweeten the chocolate because it's not that bitter. But it's actually really hard to grow those pods. And so they don't usually do that except in very expensive high-end chocolates. And then they can add things to your chocolate. They add sometimes milk in milk chocolate, because milk is sweet. There's naturally occurring sugars inside of milk called lactose, and that's really pleasant for humans to taste, unless you're lactose intolerant and you can't have that lactose milk sugar. And in that case, you don't want a milk chocolate. And then they add all kinds of other things to the chocolate as well. Now, chocolate and coffee and tea can be grown ethically. In other words, we could pay the workers a good, sustainable living wage. And when we do that, that's the right thing to do. There's really no two ways about that. I'm not going to tell you both sides of the story and tell you what. There's really fair trade and organic is the way to go. Organic means it's kind to Mother Earth, and fair trade means it's kind to the workers. And I will explain more about those concepts in just a moment. So there was a guy who had a little coffee shop, and he was looking at how much he charged for a cup of coffee. He was charging, at that time, about 20 years ago, he was charging $2 for a cup of coffee, which was a lot of money. It only cost him a few cents to make that cup of coffee. So he was making an incredibly huge profit on every single cup of coffee. But he wondered why he was making such a huge profit. And so he took a break from his very profitable coffee shop to travel down to Central America to visit some of the coffee plantations where his shop was buying the coffee beans from. And he saw the workers there living in squalor. They were living in huts. They didn't have nice new clothes. Their kids couldn't attend school. They couldn't get an education because they had to have their kids help them work the fields. They weren't being paid enough money to hire workers, so they had to have their kids help them work them. And he was appalled. That means he was very sick by looking at the working conditions of these people. And so he decided that he would create only coffee that was paying these farmers what they deserve, which is much more money than they were making. They might be making a few cents an hour, maybe only a few $100s per year. And there are still people like this 20 years later. There are still people making only a few $100s per year, or even a few $1,000s per year. And then the people that make all the money are the coffee shops. And that's just not fair. And so what he did is he came up with a policy called fair trade. And it really caught on. When people saw what was going on in his shop, they said, hey, every coffee shop should be doing this. And a lot of little mom and pop coffee shops took it on, and they decided that they were all going to go fair trade. And the real thing that changed everybody's mind was the buyers too. Once they latched onto this concept, they said, hey, we're only going to buy coffee if it's fair trade coffee, if it's been coming from a really good source. We want to make sure that the farmers are being paid a living wage and that they're not getting ripped off at the bottom of this deal. And what really made this concept take off was that Starbucks, which was the biggest coffee shop that there is, and still is the biggest coffee shop that there is, decided that they would also go fair trade. And so when they did that, almost every other coffee shop also offers fair trade coffee, or at least those high-end coffee shops. You can still get kind of the junky coffee that rips off farmers, from gas stations and junky coffee shops. But that was huge. That was a huge movement. And believe it or not, there's also fair trade chocolate. Sometimes when people own corporations, rather than doing the right thing, which is pay your workers a really good wage because they're doing all the hard work for you, they go to the countries where they can pay the people the absolute least. And in a lot of places, like right now, one of the biggest places that sells not fair trade chocolate is the Côte d'Ivoire in Africa. And they pay the people such a small wage that it's the same thing. Their kids can't even go to school because they have to have their kids come and help them to produce the chocolate. So the kids don't even have the chance to get an education or go to school or choose any other job. They're probably just going to end up farming all of their lives too and help to grow and harvest and process this chocolate. So you want to get fair trade coffee, you want to get fair trade chocolate, and you definitely want to get fair trade tea. It's the same thing. These teas that are coming out of India and China, which is most of the growing region for those teas, some places, if you think you're getting too good of a deal on tea, you probably are. And if you're paying a little bit less money, it means they're paying less money to the workers as well. So look for that fair trade tea, and you're probably also going to want to get organic tea, organic chocolate, and organic coffee as well. And why? Because organic is a way of growing things sustainably, of not spraying super poisonous chemicals and pesticides all over your plants. It doesn't mean that they don't use any chemicals and pesticides, but they use less chemicals and pesticides, and they only use organic chemicals and pesticides. Those are things that came from other plants. They took the pesticides, the organic pesticides, from other plants. For instance, marigolds are a natural pesticide. If you plant marigolds around the edge of your garden, it can often block other bugs from coming in, because once they smell those marigolds, they freak out and they don't want to go into your garden because they don't like marigolds. There's something about them that is just a natural bug blocker. So get the fair trade, get the organic, protect the earth. Organic also means that they have to do really smart things to the soil and protect the soil, protect the water. Less pesticides means less pesticides going down into the water, means less animals getting killed from horrible pesticides. It means less workers getting poisoned from these pesticides, and it means less pesticides in the food that you're just about to eat. So it benefits the earth, it benefits the atmosphere, it benefits the water, it benefits the land, it benefits the farmers, it benefits the animals that live there locally. And then whatever product you're about to buy that's organic, it benefits you. Ultimately, you are you benefit from that as well, because you're about to eat a really delicious thing. So go organic, go fair trade when possible. Make sure that people are making that living wage. And that's it for this week. I'm looking forward to seeing you next week in our last week of botany. Thank you so much for tuning in, and have an amazing and wonderful weekend. Goodbye.